All right, now we have started, so just a reminder, whatever you say will be on YouTube. As we begin, this chapter to me was a distinct chapter in the book. And those of you that read it, I hope you appreciate it the same, because what was the most unique for me with this is a whole book on marriage, and yet he takes a chapter to discuss singleness in marriage. And part of that is the intention behind how he gained the material, as he explains in this chapter. But also, this is one that I often recommend for kind of like a suggested reading in a syllabus that I give for premarital counseling with couples and things like that, as a good resource, or even those that are in a serious dating relationship and they're exploring what marriage is and those things. And so, it is a chapter that can be informative for those that are trying to explore what marriage is. And the way that he explains it, as we'll see towards the middle of our lesson tonight, really is impactful to me as to understand from a high view as to why marriage exists as an important part of our life. But as we begin this discussion on singleness, he starts it off with the goodness of singleness. Now, when we think about singleness, I'm not talking about singleness as those like high school students or whatever that are still kind of exploring their own maturity and those things, but as adults, as young adults, as older adults, singleness can often be something that can be scary, especially in the way that our world understands it. I remember in college, I had friends of mine who were like, "Man, if you don't get married in college, you just doomed. You're not going to find anybody in this generation outside of college or whatever that may be." And it's not entirely true, but that's often the fear that my chances dwindle if I get out of those normal routines of life or whatever they may be. And part of that's the way the world has shifted. But there's also this pressure that I have to find a life mate that I have to commit to, like we talked about from the beginning, someone that fulfills all of my desires and needs, and it sets them up for failure. So when we look at singleness, oftentimes we see it as something that is seasonal, that it is I'm working on myself, or I'm focusing on me, or whatever it may be, or whatever hip word the generation now wants to use. But we look at singleness a lot of times in a way that is the word Keller uses often through the chapter is in a way of deprivation. That I'm missing something because I'm single, or I'm not living a fulfilled life because I'm single, or whatever it may be. But I think there's a lot of things that we can actually learn from singleness, as he brings out, especially because Paul in Scripture, in 1 Corinthians 7 mainly, talks that singleness is a good thing. That it is something that we should enjoy, something that we should appreciate and use for God's glory, and even to the point that he says, unless you're burning with passion, you need to remain in this way. And it's kind of confusing, especially when you read Ephesians 5, like we've talked about for the past 6 weeks, that all of this language about marriage and of submitting to your spouse and of loving them as Christ loved the church, and then here's Paul in a letter to another church saying you need to stay single. So what is the balance here? And I hope that's what we can learn tonight from this. So first off, I want to hear from you all. What are things we can learn from being single? What are things that can be learned from being single?
Strengths and weaknesses.
Mm-hmm. You learn a little more about yourself. Strength and weaknesses there, yeah? Yeah. What else?
I think like being confident in who you are, and you're not like relying on someone else and their approval for how you feel. I think that's part about whenever you learn yourself first, and then what is an unnegotiable for you? What is something you have to, keep a hold of or have to have out of a relationship?
That's good. Yeah, when in seminary, I had to take more classes and read more books on discovering things about yourself than I ever thought I would in my entire life. At New Orleans and at Asbury both, and through a process called clinical pastoral education. And it was mainly to help with pastoral care as far as, how a situation, for example, a person in my cohort had lost their father to a heart attack. And so they had gone on a recent pastoral visit to someone at that similar age with a heart attack, and the visit lasted about 5 minutes. And he said, you didn't give good pastoral care because it was too personal for you, and you did not connect in the room. I say that to say that in discovering things about yourself, you learn about yourself. You learn about your weaknesses. You learn about strengths. You learn about stressors. You learn a lot of things from your own personal history that you take with you. For example, if you come from a divorced family, then you're more natural to lean towards divorce as an option. If you come from a family who the mom did all the housework and did everything about that, and the dad worked all the time, then that's the image that you've seen that you're going to emulate. And until you take time to sit down and think, what are my family of origin? How do we look at roles in the house? How do we look at who handles the finances? How do we do what have I learned in this? Then you don't necessarily know exactly what to expect coming into marriage, or what to expect from yourself even in coming into marriage. And so that is a part of singleness, learning your strengths and weaknesses, learn about yourself. What else? What other things we can learn from being single? For me, y'all may not think this or know this, but until I met Mary Evelyn my sophomore year of college, I spent the rest of my life as a single person. I know I'm too good looking to experience singleness, but that's just my life. God somehow spoke to Mary Evelyn to give me a chance. But in singleness, one of the things that I learned too was the things that I enjoyed, things that made me happy. And I had seen a lot of my friends who never had time as an individual to know themselves, what made them happy, what brought them joy. And so when they were away from a relationship, it was just they had to jump from one to another because they didn't find any type of fulfillment within themselves. So you learn a little bit about what you enjoy as well. What's the purpose of singleness?
I feel like it's more of a question of what's the purpose of marriage. It's, that same verse that talks about, don't get married until, okay, now that you are married, now this is the way that you have a lot more freedom in what decisions that you make and, how you live your life whenever it's only you have to worry about. So, it is more about why should you get married versus why should you not?
Yeah, and in chapter 7, Keller talks a lot about some of the things that are within the bounds of singleness. One of that is freedom, but the other main part of that we'll dig into in section 3 of tonight's lesson is the purpose of marriage, right? And kind of what that essence is of marriage being a representation of our relationship with Christ, and how in our singleness it is Christ who we are in that relationship with. And that the church itself is supposed to be the place where our brothers and sisters are. So the things that you gain in marriage of a significant other, of a family, and those types of things, the church is supposed to meet that need in its natural state. And so often I think we have such a low ecclesiology that we often miss how the church can be integrated in every part of our life, not just a place of education, not just a place of moral development, but a place of true community from a family standpoint. And I think you lose some of that in a larger church, where some of your smaller churches, especially if you look through like Alabama, if you drive some of the back roads and through Kentucky in that area, you see a small church almost every 10, 15 miles. And you think to yourself, well, why don't they drive up the road to the large church that's downtown? It's just right outside the city limits. It wouldn't be a 20-minute drive. Well, a lot of those churches are founded in the early 20th century or the late 19th, 18th centuries. And so you think about time, they didn't have a way to travel, especially those that were farmers and things. So they would be in a local community, a local area to work together, to serve together, to worship together in those ways. And the early church acted the same way. If you remember from Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5, they share everything together. right? Even to the point that Ananias and Sapphira are struck dead because they withheld from the community. Not that they withheld what they had given, but they had withheld the honesty. They had broken the vows of that group and community. So there's something significant about the worship community that we're in that's also supposed to help fulfill those needs of singleness that we often look for in marriage. But singleness can be a time and a season of exploration of our faith. It can also be a time where we just look and understand that I exist as a person created in the image of God, that I exist in isolation outside of a spouse. I exist. That is who I am. Matt Jordan. I am a child of God, and that means something, right? What does that mean for me? How can I serve God in this way, and not just serve Him in a way that I'm exploring someone for marriage or whatever it may be, or y'all may have seen the memes of folks who, what do you do when your crush looks at you on church and you grab like 12 chairs? How many chairs you can carry through the church? I don't know if y'all have seen this, but you have these ways that I've seen some churches who've even had dating opportunities. A larger church would have like a mingle thing for their singles class and that kinds of stuff, and you hear about all these things, and that's great, but I think the danger is that what we often do is we look at singleness and we say, how can you serve God more now, almost as if you aren't able to serve God fully in marriage. And I think it's because we have a misconstrued understanding of the two. Because in marriage, you're serving God in a separate way than you are in singleness. In singleness, you can serve God. It kind of goes with how is singleness good. Singleness can give us this fulfillment that Christ is enough for us. That's part of what we learn, is that Christ is enough for me. The needs that I want in a spouse, or the needs that I want in marriage, or the needs that I want in that type of community or relationship, I get from God. I get that from Him. I'm fulfilled in those ways. And some of that is, when you think, and how does that work sexually and with sexual temptation and things of that nature? Well, marriage, kind of to Hannah's point that we have to kind of look at what the purpose of marriage is. Marriage isn't just to fulfill sexual desire and to fulfill that type of relationship from a biblical standpoint. It's a characteristic of marriage. It's part of that. We'll talk about that next week in our last chapter. But when we understand that role of marriage, it's even deeper than that. And so in singleness, we can look at it as a good thing because it is that everything that we desire and want in life, as far as fulfillment goes, is met in Christ, and that can be enough for us. And He can use us in those ways, not necessarily more, though we may have more flexibility and freedom and those types of things, but in a unique way compared to when we're in a marriage with someone else. Because in marriage, you've got responsibilities at home where you may not have that as a single person. But in marriage also, your marriage exists in itself as its own entity, as a evangelism tool for the world to see the gospel, the way that you love your spouse. It exists in that way. So just having a healthy marriage in itself is, in a way, something God has called you to in marriage. So that's, I want that to kind of help take the gas out of that idea that singleness is a deprived life. It's a great worry for people. Now, as Keller brings out, he's got folks who have come to his church from outside of New York who have said, I'm trying to find someone, I don't know what I want in singleness. He said, then they get in New York and it's just, hey, you don't need to marry someone until you've got a great established 401k. You don't need to marry someone until everything in your life is set and as successful as you want, because you won't be able to give enough to it. And he said both are wrong, and we'll talk about that at the tips to consider there. But when we think of the way that singleness is often seen in the world, so often it is seen as something that a single person is missing out on all the greater parts of life that you gain in marriage. But then, as we understand in the first part of the chapter, so often those that are married tell a different story, that you need to stay single as long as you can, and you're missing it. And what does that say about the institution of marriage? And so it's kind of that, if we look at it from a way of singleness can be a way of deprivation, it's almost like the grass is greener on the other side. Because there are parts you give up when you, again, submitting to one another, loving as Christ loved the church. There are parts of your life you give up in marriage things that are great and joyful, things that you may enjoy, but also things that are worthwhile to love your spouse, which is why those things dig a little deeper. So when we look at the second part there, the benefits of singleness, one of the things that he brings out a lot is what is God's best. He uses an article from a writer consistently in the chapter. But when we think about what God gives us, His best for us, and those benefits there within singleness, what does it mean that God's best is enough for us?
I think for me, it's learning that all my hopes and dreams and desires being met in Him. And some of the things that I hope, dream, and desire may not be good for me. And I've learned by being patient and looking around me and waiting out or participating in the wait time, the fulfillment in God is so much better than the easy microwave fix of everyday life.
Yeah. And to use this as a comical example, y'all know we have a toddler who likes to throw fits. Some of y'all say, I've never seen John Graham throw a fit. Well, he's on great behavior at church. But I'm learning, that because I've read it time and time again. I mean, I've read a book that's published by Brooks Brothers on raising a young gentleman. I've read all of those things and listened to the podcast. But when you're sitting there and you've got a toddler who you've locked the door so they don't run out to get in the pool, is screaming and yelling and kicking his feet, or because you won't let him play with a steak knife, it's like, is this worth it? Just to let them throw a little fit. But I know that if we don't allow that and don't allow him to cope and understand that just you're going to be told no. No means no. You got to learn these parts of life. That correcting that behavior as a teenager and as an adult is going to be significantly more difficult than at a young child's age. Thank God I've got two people at home that are behavior specialists that are a lot better at that than I am. But it is something that's a reminder for me spiritually too, that there is one that is sovereign who knows better. And though in singleness and in marriage even, right, when times get tough, that there may be something else I desire or something else that I want, but I have to submit to God and submit to His will. And in singleness, oftentimes, it's kind of the hardest to do because in singleness, there's a stage of life where, especially for young singles, where you find yourself in this position that you feel like you really are missing out. Where everybody around you is getting married, or everybody around you is getting engaged, or whatever it may be, or everybody around you is a relationship, and it's like, well, I'm beyond the third wheel. I'm like the rear axle at this point, and you just try to navigate what that is. You want something greater, but you have to know that what God has in store is enough, and that what God has planned is great, whatever that looks like for you. And I think part of that is just relying upon His sovereignty. And relying upon Him for those things. Because part of that too is when you think about those benefits of singleness and understanding that God's best is enough, it is that there are things that I desire that may not be healthy. There are things that I want that may not be right for me or may not be godly. There are parts of our life that we don't often understand now that, if we could read backwards, then how the old phrase goes, hindsight's always 20/20. If you were able to see then what to know then what you know now, you would do it differently, or you would make a different decision, or you would respond to it in a better way. And so when you look at the same way of God's best, it's understanding that reassurance that what God has in store for you, you may not understand now, but it can be used in a greater way in the future. And another benefit of singleness is it does give you freedom to serve the Lord, and I hesitated to use the greater way, but in different ways, in unique ways. Because in singleness, you're able to have more freedom with your own schedule, to be able to use it for different things. the way you utilize a lot of your time, to where we had a discussion in college. I had some folks in my classes who were married, or a couple of them that had kids or whatever it may be, and a lot of folks would ask the question, well, is it sinful? I went to the Baptist college, so everything was about sinfulness. Is it sinful that we would, and I think people ask this to get out of homework, if I go home and I prioritize my studies for all of these things, I neglect my wife and kids for the sake of an A, when I know that if I spent time with them and studied when everybody went to sleep, that I could at least get a B. And our professor said, to everybody's surprise, yes. As a believer in Jesus, and as a husband or as a wife or as a father or a mother, you have a greater responsibility to love your spouse and your kids, but you also have a responsibility to love the Lord. So it's sinful to say, I'm not doing my homework because I'm going to be playing ball with my kids today. But it is also just as sinful to say I'm neglecting them for the sake of schoolwork. We all vowed not to teach our teenagers that later in life, so that they would do their work. But it was one of those things to understand that when we look at the way that we serve the Lord in our homes, that there is a position that we have to understand and take, that when you look at what is best for the glory and honor of God, we can't clone ourselves to say, like A.W. Tozer. A.W. Tozer's wife, were in seasons couldn't stand it because he would neglect their family for hours and days, spending time in prayer and away from the home. Great holy things. But he has a responsibility as well to love his wife and to love his kids. And he did not do that. There was another one, William Wilberforce, I want to say it was, maybe someone else. Anyways, they just left their wife and kids at home and went to Africa or somewhere to do missions. Well, is that, like, you just abandoned your family to do this? Like, is that really what God calls you to do? Or can he call you to go and do that for weeks at a time instead of going over there for a lifetime and abandoning them, or whatever it may be? And so I think that when we look at ways that we serve the Lord in marriage, we have to look at it from a different perspective of what's the greatest calling upon my life as a believer. What's my first call to do? But in singleness, we do have unique ways in which we can serve the Lord, right? We may be able to do things later at night. We may be able to do things where we have more flexibility with our finances. We may have ways that we're able to give of our time in different ways, which is probably the greatest way. But it's not necessarily in singleness you can serve the Lord in a greater way as much as it is you can serve the Lord in more unique ways. Because if God, were to say, "Hey, John, I'm calling you to go to Boston and plant a church, and you're going to take people pheasant hunting outside in the New England area on Saturdays for church service." Well, one, I don't even know if there's pheasants there in Massachusetts. But if he's calling John to that, and he's married and has roots and all those things, I mean, it's kind of hard to uproot all of that based on just a calling that he has, at least at the easier parts of things. But if he's single and says, I spent some time in prayer for this and fasted, I really feel like God's calling me to this, then it's not as painful or difficult or worrisome, because he's not having to make a decision that affects another person as much as it is just himself and his calling on God. So singleness does have some unique ways in that, unique benefits, if you will. Oftentimes it's a greater depth of spiritual maturity, not always. I think we can all probably say we learn more about God's grace when we become parents or when we marry someone. But at the same time, with the greater depth of spirituality, again, if you want to stay up all night, spend hours and hours and hours reading Scripture, you can do that without the neglect of a loved one. You can do those things in different manners. But the other is, as a benefit of singleness, the church is to serve as that family, right? As brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents, eliminating, as he says, the consistent burden of having to find someone and what those benefits often come with. The church is supposed to serve in that. And as he brings out, singleness in Christianity is a beautiful way of life. And part of that is because it is that Christ is enough, right? That there's not another one that we need. But it's also that that when we look at at the way that we understand our life and existence, right? We're not having to find it met in another human or another person of this world, but we find it in Christ, and that is a beautiful, beautiful thing, that in singleness, I still have a purpose. Because in a lot of religions and in a lot of the world, especially over time, the pressure has been that unless you were married and procreating and those things, then you were not living a full life. To the point that he brought out that there were certain rulers who would even have a fine if you were widowed for too long, because you needed to be married. And which I thought was kind of strange, but what does Christianity say? That we're going to take care of the widows. That they don't need to rush into that. They don't need to do anything. We're going to take care of them. We're going to feed them. We're going to make sure they have what they need. And the same when we think about the way that we understand marriage. It's not just about curbing some type of sexual desire or whatever it may be, but it's a fulfilling way that we can show the world the beauty of our relationship with Christ, which brings us into our third point there. That marriage is penultimate. So, penultimate is in a $3 word, the center of everything. The central point of certain aspects. I learned it this way in pastoral care, that there's if you will, take three rings. There's the anti-penultimate, which is your very outside things of you're talking to someone and it's hey Joanna, how's the weather? And that's just kind of where we talk, how's your day going? It's not awful, it's not great. And then you got the ultimate, which is there in the second ring, which is like, honestly, it's not going that great. I lost a loved one this week and I'm kind of struggling with that. And then the penultimate, like the dead center, it's like, I'm really struggling with all of this, but mainly because, I don't want to die. Well, there's the heart of the problem, right? There's the center of the conversation right there. And so when we look at the way that we understand this in marriage, it's also a way to say what is the penultimate part of marriage. And the reason it's the deepest center of our life is so often because it is a reflection of the relationship we have with Christ. So at the very origins of marriage, it's not there just for sexual fulfillment. It's not just there for companionship. It's not just there for better tax breaks. It's not just there for whatever part of life or justification we want to make, other than our marriages exist to show the world the beauty of the relationship we have with Jesus. Because that is our ultimate purpose of marriage, is to reflect visibly of our relationship with God. And so for that, singleness can also, in a way, achieve the same thing, to say that Christ is enough, that I don't have to look for this in another person. But in marriage, going back to Hannah's question at the beginning, when we think about the purpose then of marriage, that central aspect of marriage, it's not about anything that the world says that it is for us as believers in Jesus. It's not about fulfillment. It's not about achieving things, as statistics show. And we may have seen this in the book, or I may have read it somewhere else, but statistics show income of couples is higher when they're married. There's longer longevity in a person's life in marriage, that especially in men, there are a lot of benefits personally and physically and financially to marriage. But the world pushes that on us, that these are things that you need in marriage to fulfill your life with a sexual partner or whatever it may be. But they make it such a contract that it's when these things aren't being met, then you break it and you go find someone else. Where in Christianity, we view it in a different way. That marriage is a commitment that I have made with another person to visibly represent the gospel to the world. This is whom I love. And even if these things aren't met, I'm going to continue to love them. I'm going to continue to submit myself to them. I'm going to continue to sacrifice my life for them and to put their needs before my own. I'm going to continue, as Ephesians 5 teaches us, right, to love them as Christ loved the church, which was to love them even before their salvation, but to love them to the point that I'm willing to give my life for them. Right? If you think back to John 3:16 there. God so loved the world that he sent his son, right? He loved us, so he saved us. And so when we think about marriage and its purpose, it takes away almost for singleness that immediate desire to fulfill a need. and it gives more of a foundation that whether I'm single or whether I'm married, my purpose as an individual does not change. Because I'm to be holy as Christ is holy. I'm to be the child of God I'm called to be and to develop these things. So I do that whether I'm married or whether I'm single. This is the same purpose. So my identity does not change. What changes is in marriage, there's a greater responsibility now upon my life that when I make this commitment and covenant with another person, we're doing this in the sake of showing the gospel to the world. So one way he puts it is that the goodness in seeking marriage is seeking deeper spiritual lives with another, as he brings out, what if we looked at things to say, I can see my spouse for who they're going to be, not just who they are in Jesus. And we commit to marriage together to celebrate the deepening of our spiritual lives together. And not just to celebrate what we fulfill in one another's life, but how we can help each other grow in our faith. And of course, Paul speaks of it too, not necessarily in a way of negativity, of the way that when like he almost puts it this way: if you just can't control your passion and your sexual temptation, then you just need to go ahead and get married. And that's one way of looking at it. A buddy of mine actually moved up his wedding date because of that. He had moved his wedding date up, and I called him. I was like, "Man, like, everything all right? Is everything okay?" And he's like, "Man, that verse that Paul writes about in 1 Corinthians 7, that burning with a desire?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Yeah." We decided to move the wedding date on up. I was like, "All right, hey, at least you're being biblical. That's great." But when we think about this passage in a deeper context, for Paul, it's not simply in that tongue-in-cheek way. If you just can't control yourself, you just need to get married. But it is in a deeper way. If you have such passion for someone, if you have such desire for them and such love for them, then you need to get married. That's the right thing to do, to fuel that passion, to commit to that life with one another. But the difference, and he has a section on this that I didn't include in here, but in the chapter, he brings it out right after this discussion of what it means as a single to be in the dating world and what that looks like. And part of that is in the past, dating was understood as courtship. And of going out and all these different things and who you're going steady with or whatever it may be. But in today's world, especially for upperclassmen and college students and adults, they have what we call the hookup generation. That there's no there's no emotional ties to sexual activity. That I can have sexual involvement with someone in a hookup way, and that's it. If we want to pursue a relationship, that's great. If we don't, that's great. Where in the past, it's not that those things didn't happen, but they happened within relationships and things often further down the road. But when we look at the way that dating has changed in the generations now, these are things that our college students or young adults or others are facing, is that this is often the expected reality of folks when they go on a dating website for someone, or if they go on to some type of socialite organization or something to meet someone, that's almost in the back of their mind of an expected reality. And so singleness and dating in the modern world for a believer in Jesus can often be a struggle. Because if our singleness is supposed to be in the way that we date someone of looking for a spouse or looking for someone who could be someone that is marriage quality, marriageable, whatever word we want to come up with there, that could be worthy of being a good spouse for us. There are parts of that change when we understand that in dating, oftentimes it's about what immediate passion and fulfillment we can meet. And so there's often a misbalance, an imbalance, if you will, for those that are believers in Jesus, of how to date in this world. Which brings us, when we dig into tips to consider in singleness, one part of this that I really want us to talk about.
Before you go on, would you expand on that word penultimate?
Penultimate?
I see it as next to last.
Mm-hmm.
But in this context, it's not, is it?
No, in this context, penultimate is that of which, when we think about marriage, that it exists to show the world of our relationship with Jesus. And so we can,
Last then.
right, so we can do that in singleness with our relationship with Christ. And so in our marriages, that's what Keller's trying to bring out, is that so often we look at marriage as the top priority in the Western world. Right? This is what should be first for us to pursue in marriage, because of all the things that it fulfills for us. But as believers in Jesus, we see it as penultimate in the way that when we look at the way that we see marriage as a visible representation of our relationship with God, that it doesn't have such a burden upon our life to get married, because it's something we can already show the world in our singleness with our relationship with Jesus. Put that in a simpler way, the world says that as a person to have a fulfilled life, the quicker that you're able to get married and begin life as an adulthood and having kids and things, the better off you are. The higher chance of success you have, all of those things. Well, what that does is, as a single person, that puts a lot of pressure on you, right? That I've got to do this. What if I make the wrong decision? What if I fall in love with someone that I'm not supposed to? What if I second guess myself? Or what if I just go with, this person will be okay? It's not necessarily who I want to marry, but I know that if I don't propose, the chances of us meeting someone after college are slim to none. It puts a lot of pressure on you when that's the reality, that next to having a career, marriage is what you need to have. So for Keller, he brings out the point that marriage is penultimate, is next to last, for that very reason, because it doesn't meet anything in our life that we don't already have in Christ. That marriage instead is something that is a symbol of our relationship with Christ to the world. Does that make any sense? Some.
Okay, my fat dumb is slow, so I need to go back and look at it.
He brings it out almost in a way that when we
The word just doesn't fit.
No, it doesn't. No, because and I think part of that too is we're conditioned in the way that marriage for us is something, especially when we talk about a class on the meaning of marriage, that it's significant, that it's not next to last, right? This should be a top priority for our lives. But in the context of singleness, what Keller's trying to bring out is that in your singleness, what you gain in marriage as a believer in Jesus doesn't change anything about who you are.
That makes sense.
And so the desire for marriage then can be next to last, or at the very least can have a more central part of your life other than meeting a need. It is something that is central to your relationship with Jesus, and so it can fit in that capacity.
Excuse me, I did that.
No, that's a good question. That's a good question. Well, and it is confusing in that way because, even in the church, so often singleness is put off as either a burden, or it's oftentimes put off as who are we going to pull for our volunteers for lock-ins for the teenagers? Who are we going to utilize to look to almost in a way utilize them as free access volunteers, right? They have ultimate time. Maybe not ultimate resources, but ultimate time to use. And what we do is, in doing that, we almost put it off that as a single person in the church, like unless you have stated, God is calling me to celibacy, which I believe He does call people to that we're putting the pressure on you to get married. And what does that do? It's the same thing as the world, except we use it from the spin of as a believer in Jesus, right? You need to be married, so you curb your passions and desires. Well, let's just all be honest and real with one another. Being in marriage doesn't curb your passions and desires. Now, we have to submit ourselves to where we put that focus on one person. But if that was the case, if marriage just did that magically, we wouldn't have affairs. We wouldn't have adultery take place in the home. We wouldn't have these things that occur. We wouldn't have porn addiction and other things if marriage was just a magic pill to cure all of that. So that's obviously not even logical to say that marriage exists to curb your desires. And as we've seen in other parts, and I think we'll see it in the next one too, that saying, well, my spouse should fulfill those needs for me. Well, some would call that sexual abuse. even in the home of marriage. So in the way that we look at the way that we honor our spouses, husband and wives, curbing our desires is often the work we do within ourselves, within the Holy Spirit. Well, if I'm a single person, I do that. If I'm a married person, I do that. Because if I'm a person who is a sinner, who is saved by God, and I struggle with sinfulness, whatever it may be, I have to do this work with the Holy Spirit within me to be holy. And it doesn't matter if I'm married or not. Right now, it helps when you're married. You got someone you can confide in and someone that you can express things to. But it often, again, if it was a magic pill to fix all of our desires in the world, we wouldn't have divorces. We wouldn't have those things. It's just not how it works and exists. So in the church, as Keller brings out, this conversation about singleness is one, that there is a purpose to it, that there is something beautiful about singleness. But there's also something significant about marriage. But as a believer in Jesus, what you gain in marriage is not all that much different as to what you gain as a single person. Instead, what you gain in marriage is almost like a teammate to help you deepen your spiritual life, not just to meet and fulfill desires for your life. As the world often shifts it as, who do you marry? You marry someone that is successful, or someone that is fun, or someone that is loving. And, Hallmark movies are the worst, because here it is some person who's a stay-at-home mom or secretary or whatever that barely makes minimum wage, and they're married to a millionaire set to inherit his family's company that owns like 12,000 beach houses, and they go off into the cabin in the snow in the woods, and they fall in love with a lumberjack, and they just leave all the world behind for the sake of love. Well, that's beautiful, right? Until they're on food stamps and wondering when they're going to be able to make a log home and all those types of things. And it's like, why would you trade a wonderful life with people that you love in a city that you love, for someone that has a Christmas tree farm, and one Christmas tree farm, not multiple, right? Small one in town, only seasonal. That's not a lot of
bankruptcy too. That's that one.
That's it.
I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like we got to do a fundraiser to get you out of bankruptcy. But we understand that too. Like that's almost the ideal for people. It's like I want to be in a relationship where it's just based on love and nothing else matters. Well, everybody would like that, right? I would also like to have everything I want in life and not work for it. But that's not how the world spins. And so when we think oftentimes about marriage and singleness, we set those parameters to say, if you're a single person, you need to discern for your life someone that you can love, someone you can go home happy to. Well, that's true, but also as a believer in Jesus is someone who wants the best for me, who can speak honestly with me, who wants to see me at my best spiritually, who wants to grow my faith within me. Not just someone who gives me butterflies in my stomach and has bad habits. But someone who really cares and loves for me in this way, or is willing to do this together with me. And that kind of, for me, it kind of helps me with that parameter of the things that the world says we need to find in a spouse, we already find in Christ, whether we're single or married. And so marriage can be penultimate in the sense that its only existence is really for us to give a symbol to the world that we have a relationship with Christ and to procreate. So these are both biblical things, but we can also see them, other than the procreation, within singleness as well. So it exists as something that can be a good way of life in that too. All right, tips to consider. These are some things he lists off that we'll just go through real quickly. One, there are seasons not to explore marriage relationships. I love this because in singleness, we think, well, I'm always available. Well, I don't know about you, but when someone dies, I'm not always the happiest, especially if it's someone in my family or that I love. So that may not be the best time for me to try to be emotionally mature with another person, right? Because I'm weak in that way. Or a new job where I may be traveling or transferring and those types of things. It's y'all know if you've ever watched any type of Netflix show or anything like that, and it's like, oh man, I wish you would, give up your career in life in New York and move to LA, across the world essentially. For what? Well, for love. Why? We just met. But we haven't made it through the hour-long movie. You want to move across the world. But when we think about the way that relationships work, oftentimes that's people's expectations, right? That is spontaneous. But there is something of being just a mature person in general, to be able to say, this is not a good time, I'm not thinking clearly, and being able to understand that there are seasons not to explore those relationships. Understand the gift of singleness, and I do think that's a gift in some ways, because you do have a lot of freedom in that. You've got a lot of individual time, ability to go and do and all those types of things without the consideration of another. Because as you all know, marriage is hard. You have to submit to another person. You've got to sacrifice for another person. And sometimes that sacrifice isn't just longer hours at work. Sometimes that sacrifice is time with friends that you once had, or times doing activities that you need to spend more time at home with, or whatever it may be. So sacrifice and submission, again, we talked about last week, are both important parts of marriage. And so singleness can be seen as a gift in that. Again, as you age, be more serious about seeking marriage and its purpose, especially purpose there. So as you get older, I think that marriage begins to mean more than it does as a young person, and mean more, maybe not so much in the same ways either, but it means something different as an older person, and so someone that is aging. So be more serious about seeking marriage and its purpose in that way. And I love this one, point D there under number 4. Don't allow yourself deep emotional involvement with a non-believer. This is important. Because so often when we think about Scripture, we look at that passage that Paul writes to say, don't be unequally yoked with someone. That's not egg yolks, okay? That is a tool like Jesus spoke of, where his burden, his line, his yoke is easy. That it is a tool to latch an animal to a piece of agricultural equipment with. And it's the same way here. I don't know how many of you have ever driven a car where you got one tire pressure that's about 25 and the other front tire pressure is 55. You can't keep it on the road. Doesn't even if the wind's blowing or not, right? It just doesn't work that way because it's unequally yoked, right? And so when you think about that in marriage, it's the same way because it is something of greatest depth. When you think about marriage at the forefront, it's I love this person. I can't see my life without them. I'm just really in love with them. But then when you have to make decisions, where are we going to go to church? Are we going to go to church? Where do we raise our children?
I can change them.
I can change them is often a big one, and you can't. I mean, you just can't. Now you could change them from Baptist to Methodist or Catholic to whatever. You could do that for sure, but you can't change someone from being a non-believer to being a believer. You just can't do it. And as a matter of fact, I know of a friend of mine from many years ago who was dating this person in high school. They began to continue dating in college, and they were madly in love with one another. But the hard decision that they found was that some of the deepest parts of life they didn't agree with. Number one was faith. He was a non-believer. She was a believer. He also didn't want kids. He was more focused on his career. She wanted kids, wanted them so bad. And they just couldn't agree on some of the most important parts of life. And so the other is when you think about that statement of with emotional involvement with a non-believer, it's almost like, well, what about evangelism or what about these things? Well, that's not the same conversation as existing for the purpose of marriage, right? What's the purpose of marriage as a believer in Jesus? The purpose of marriage and a believer in Jesus is to symbolize our relationship with Christ. Well, how can we do that with someone who is not a believer in Jesus Christ? You can't fulfill the purpose of marriage with someone who is not a believer as a follower of Christ. The other is he brings out the things that we evaluate life from, right? Like we, for example, Lord of the Rings, okay? It's written by J.R.R. Tolkien, right? The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings series, Home on Yards, okay? I love it, right? But I also know that it's not just some fictional fairy world, but this is Tolkien speaking of some of the deeper things of Christianity, of good versus evil and things of that nature. Same with C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. And it's not just a fictional story to make me feel good or to be good cinema or whatever, but it is something deeply spiritual, right? That's how I see it. The same when if you ever watch a movie and you see someone like the Grinch who has his heart's grown 3 sizes because someone's done something good for him despite his own actions, despite his own behavior. Well, Think about the change of heart we have in our sinfulness as we go out against the world and against God, yet He loves us and dies for us and gives us new life despite our sinfulness. It can change our hearts. As a believer in Jesus, we see the world in those ways, right? We see the world in the ways of graciousness. We see the world in the ways that we speak kindly to people, that marriage is to be between one man and one woman, and not have third wheels in marriage and these types of things, because that's how we view things through the lens of Scripture. But if you're in deep emotional involvement with someone who's a non-believer, then where do they get their guidance from? Right? How can those things be seen the same? Morality and spirituality are two different things in entirety. So there are parts of life that when you think deeply about that, it's an important aspect to consider. And you'd be amazed at the couples that I talk to, and thankfully I've not had this experience, but some of them, I always bring it up. The first one, I was like, when I get to know the couple, especially if I don't know them, to find out where they go to church and those things. Because if not, man, it's hard to say to someone, you're to love your spouse as Christ loved the church. Well, I don't know Jesus or love Jesus. Then why do you love your spouse? It makes it difficult, almost to the point of doing a funeral for someone who's a non-believer. I mean, what do you say, right? What do you say at that? And so those are some of those difficult parts that are just things we have to ask, right? Another is that attraction in the most comprehensive sense, and what he means by that is in the way that we're attracted. That shouldn't be the only reason that we marry someone, the only reason that we love someone. This really brings up the example of the hookup culture, that's just kind of where that leads to, right? But on the other side, he says, don't be uncommitted. Don't allow it to be at all not any part of your conversation. It's kind of like the worst of both ends. And in a way, it's to say, don't allow your passion to drive and be the only decision maker for you in a relationship with someone, but also don't be so unpassionate that you just say, hey, this is a nice person, and you don't know anything about them, right? You don't have any care or concern for them. So there is a place in the middle there. And the last one there, which I think is so important, is listen and submit to the community input of others. What that means is listen to your friends and family about that person, because so often they're right, because they see what we don't often see. There's a beautiful example, if you will, of a window. It's called Johari's window, and it's about understanding yourself. But in this window, there's 4 panes. Okay, there is the pane that is what I know and everybody knows, right? This is Matt Jordan. He's a pastor. He's an Alabamian. He pulls for Alabama, and he likes cutting grass. And then there's this second pane. This is just what I know, right? Well, I love drinking coffee, but that's not a secret to anybody. Matt likes sappy love stories and secretly watches Hallmark movies or whatever it may be. This other window, right? Things that deeply I know about myself that no one else really knows. And it's a lot more deeper than that, but just for the sake of conversation. And then the third window down here is what others see. Like, Matt's got an attitude problem, or, he's arrogant or snarky or whatever it may be. Things that other people see that you don't see about your own self. And then there's that fourth pane, right? This is the unknown. Like, no one knows this. I don't know this. These are things that we just don't know yet about ourselves. And in the same way, people view our spouses and significant others and those we date in the same way, right? To say, I know that such and such is a good person. I know that they're an educator, or I know that they are a good hard worker. And right, that this person is secretly kind. They really, the big thing, like, that they're just a big old teddy bear, or whatever. But what do they see? Like, they see somebody that puts you down all the time. They see someone who doesn't respect you. They see someone who doesn't love your family. And let me help you. When you marry someone, you marry their family. They see things that you don't see or refuse to accept, right? And then of course there's always the unknown. But what so often is we just don't, you just don't know them like I know them. Okay. Well, you haven't seen them in the way that I've seen them. Okay. And what we do is we just completely ignore the valid opinions of everybody else. At least we should consider them, right? Consider that input from the community to say, that person is they don't respect you. Well, you don't see how they talk to me at home. Well, if that's how they talk to you in public, I'd hate to see how they talk to you at home. And so often we refuse to listen, but it is so important in singleness and in marriage too to listen and submit as well to that input of other people. So again, this chapter has been one for me that is significant because it does bring us to a point to say, whether singleness or whether married, my existence as a believer in Jesus does not change. The intention upon my life as a believer in Jesus does not change. What does change is that I view marriage almost in a higher regard, but not in a regard to the point that my entire existence as a person is to become married, right? I find all those things in Jesus. But as he brings out at the end of the chapter there, Christian marriage does proclaim the gospel, right? That's his existence. That it's almost two people coming together for the sake of proclaiming the good news is why we exist in marriage in those ways. So anybody got any questions before we close the recording tonight? Awesome.